Once upon a time. Where can that take us? Where has it taken us? Where will it take us tomorrow? As you know, stories have been told over the ages in every culture, in every religion, in every land. And one reason for their popularity, of course, is that they entertain us. For example, did you hear the one about Sherlock Holmes and his friend Dr. Watson? Jokes are stories too, you know. Once upon a time, Holmes and Watson went on a camping trip, and after a good evening meal, they got into their tent and went to sleep. A few hours later, Holmes woke up and nudged Dr. Watson and said, "Watson, wake up and tell me what you see." Watson said, "I see millions and millions of stars." "And what does that tell you, my dear Watson?" Watson thought for a moment, knowing he was being tested, and finally he said, "Well, from the point of view of astrophysics, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observed that Saturn is in Leo, so we should be careful tomorrow. Chronologically, I deduce that the time is approximately 3:15 in the morning. And meteorologically, I suspect we'll have a beautiful sunny day tomorrow." And he was ready to go back to sleep, but he looked at Holmes and realized he hadn't given the right answer. So finally he turned to him and said, "Okay, what do you see?" And Holmes said, "Watson, you've missed the point. Someone has stolen our tent. That's why you see stars." So the first purpose of a story is entertain you. It doesn't have to do anything more than that to be a good story. But it also does usually do more than that. Like with this last story, reminds us that we can miss something right in front of our face. Consider this story from the Muslim mystic Jalaluddin Rumi, whom we already heard a little bit of during the prayer. A merchant kept a bird in a cage. He was going to India, the land from which the bird came, and so he asked her, his bird, whether he could bring back anything for her. And the bird said, "Please give me my freedom." But the merchant said no. So she asked him to visit a jungle in India where her relatives lived and to announce her captivity to the birds that were there. The merchant agreed, and he went to the jungle in India, where he did announce the bird's captivity. But no sooner had he spoken than a wild bird, one just like his own, fell dead out of a tree onto the ground. And the merchant thought, "Oh, this must be a relative of his own bird." And he kind of felt sad that he'd caused that bird's death. When he got home, his pet bird asked him whether he'd brought any good news from India. And the merchant said, "No, actually, I'm afraid my news is bad. One of your relatives collapsed and fell at my feet when I mentioned your captivity." As soon as he said this, his own bird collapsed and fell to the bottom of the cage. Now, so far, this is merely an interesting story. But listen, there's something more. Okay, the merchant's bird collapsed and fell to the bottom of the cage. "Oh no," said the merchant. "The news of her relative's death has killed my bird too." Sorrowfully, he picked up his bird from the bottom of the cage and laid her body out on the windowsill. No sooner had he done that, the bird revived and flew away to a nearby tree. The merchant was very surprised at this, and the bird said, "Now you know that what you thought was a tragic story was in fact a good story for me, for you showed me how to escape and free myself by telling me about the bird in the jungle." And the bird flew away free at last. Jalaluddin Rumi, who lived in the 13th century, used to tell this story to his followers to teach them about indirect learning, that there may be truth where you're not looking for it, that there may be knowledge to save your life if you're willing to listen to the story hidden within the story. Now, sometimes a story can be not only revealing, but in some way healing. In the Hindu tradition, people who are suffering from psychological problems are sometimes given a Hindu fable or a story of one of the gods or goddesses and told to meditate on it. By thinking about how the hero or other protagonist dealt with the problems at hand, the hero of the story begins to discover his or her own solution. I think a good story always has the potential for healing. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber once said, a story must be told in such a way that it constitutes help in itself. My grandfather, he said, was lame. Once they asked him to tell a story about his teacher, and he related how his teacher used to hop and dance while he prayed. And my grandfather rose as he spoke and was so swept away by the story that he began to hop and dance to show how the master had done. From that hour, he was cured of his lameness. Now that's how to tell a story. Of course, I don't want to give the impression that a revealing or a healing story is pain-free. In the Jewish scriptures, the prophet Nathan tells King David a story that is healing and revealing, but painful. You may remember that King David committed adultery with Bathsheba, and when he found out she was pregnant, he tried to bring her husband home from war so that the husband could have relations with her and think it was his own son. But the husband wouldn't have relations with his wife because a soldier wasn't supposed to do that during a war. So David arranged to have him put at the front of the battle and then had the others draw back so he'd be sure he'd be killed. And then David took Bathsheba as his wife. But the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David to tell him a story. Nathan came to David and said to him, "There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little lamb. And it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and the rich man was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity.' And Nathan said to David, 'You are that man.'" And David realizes his guilt. He's the one who has stolen someone else's thing. He does atonement. And the interesting thing about this story is that it briefly became a part of the American story when it became public that President Clinton had had sexual relations with an intern. At that time, a number of ministers and rabbis pointed out to their congregations that King David had actually done something much worse than Clinton, and yet the Bible claims King David was the greatest king Israel ever had. Yet the people most willing to call the Bible the Word of God, these clergy said, seemed least willing to forgive the president for something, a less heinous crime. And the other interesting thing about the story, of course, is that Nathan told David is that it still has power. I mean, don't we all, when we hear the story of David and the story within the story, which David used to confront David, don't we all think, my gosh, haven't there been times when I was righteously angry at someone for what I thought they did, when it turns out I was guilty of the same or worse? As one example of the power of a story, I heard about a family whose kids were all very interested in the military, and it all went back to their great-great-great-granddaddy who'd been alive during the Civil War. He always told his family and friends about the various battles he'd been in during the Civil War, and he walked with a limp because of one of his injuries. And his stories became part of the family tradition, and his kids and their kids and their kids all became military officers or went to military academies, etc., all because of this family story. Finally, someone did some research and found out that their great-great-great-grandfather had never actually fought in the Civil War. He had paid someone to take his place, but he was embarrassed about it, so he moved to another town and walked with a limp all of his life to make his story seem plausible. You see, even though the story wasn't true, it had a lot of influence over generations of descendants. So a story can entertain, it can teach, it can bring wholeness, and it can give you history and identity. In other words, It can be appealing, revealing, healing, and give you that grounded feeling. There you go. Again, my low-tech version of things. The only thing I would add to that is that stories need not be literally true to contain truth. Jesus' parables are an example of that. In fact, for me, one of the most powerful parables of all time is his parable of the Good Samaritan. Powerful, too, are the tales of the Sufi mystics and the stories of Hindu mythology and the wonderfully ironic Zen parables of Buddhism, one of which I'll tell you. When Jan mentioned that the stories her late husband used to tell all tended to have an off-color ending, this one kind of does. So, Jan, wherever you are, there you are, inspired me for this one. And actually, this story is a very powerful one for me, too. The story is Su Tung Po sailed across the Yangtze River to visit Fo Ying. And when he got there, his home was empty, and they didn't have phones in those days. So he left a note, and he said, Su Tung Po, his own name, Su Tung Po cannot be conquered, not even by the 8 winds. And then he went back home. And when Fo Ying got home, he saw the note and wrote on it. And again, there's no good word to substitute here, so he wrote on it, "What you have written is a fart." And he had it sent back to Su Tung Po. And Su Tung Po saw this and was very angry, and he got back in his boat and he sailed back across the river and grabbed Fo Ying by the neck and said, how dare you write this letter to me? And Fo Ying just smiled and said, Su Tung Po, who cannot be conquered not even by the 8 winds, has just been blown across the Yangtze River by a fart. The question to ask when hearing a story is not always, did this happen? As interesting as that may be. But does this story have something to say to me? Can I learn something from it? Can I find healing in some way? So I have a little homework assignment for you today. You won't get graded on it, and it's only a suggestion, so it's up to you whether you want to do it or not. But my suggestion is this. Ask the people you care about today for their stories and share some of yours. If you have kids or grandkids, tell them the stories of what you were like and what your parents were like and the parents of your parents, if you know. And ask your kids about their life. What has happened to them? What kind of story are they looking forward to? Stories tell us who we are and where we come from. And sometimes they even point the way to what we may yet be, as the story we saw in the video does for me. And they don't have to all be serious. They don't even have to be factually true. Is there a story that you or whoever you talk to today really like, one that has meant a lot to how you live, or one that has changed your life for the better or worse? Are there funny fables or amusing anecdotes, laudatory legends or naughty narratives, riveting rumors or panoramic parables, inspiring incidents or spiritual sagas? Isn't that great? I just did all that alliteration there. Stories can be very powerful. In fact, much of who and what we are has been formed by stories. Stories about our family, stories about our neighborhood, stories about our religion, stories about the history of the universe, stories about our country. Your story is the most interesting part of you. You see, your philosophy may tell us what you think, but your story tells us who you are. And given the choice, most people would rather hear your story than your opinion. Hear the stories of those around you and share your own, including your story of how you became a Unitarian Universalist. It's an amazing story. In the process, you will enter other worlds and come back to find your own world enlarged, and maybe even your heart enlarged as well. I decided if I had time, I would tell you the story of the song we're about to sing, and it looks like we have a few minutes, so I'm going to.